Hi, class. I want to talk a moment about the arrival of Europeans in the Americas, and I'm going to shatter a few myths for you too. Columbus never really made it to the Americas. He landed in the Caribbean islands, and that's about as far as he will go. He also wasn't the first to arrive in the New World, as they're going to call it. The Vikings were here first class. Leif Erikson came to Newfoundland and that region for a while. Now, after today's lecture, I think you're going to have some thought too about if we should still celebrate Columbus Day. Is this Christopher Columbus? It looks like him, right? Sorry, but we're just not too sure. There are actually no known contemporary paintings of Christopher Columbus. This was actually painted 10 years or so after his death, but we all accept this as his image, correct? But in order to understand the New World and the Europeans coming, we need to know why, I think. There's a lot of reasons why Europeans start this new age of exploration, the age of discovery. During the Middle Ages, class, in Europe, from about 500 to 1500, this was extremely tough times. There was, first of all, the Little Ice Age. Temperatures had plummeted. There was excessive rain, poor harvest, that leading to the Great Famine. The Catholic Church had become very controlling. Excuse me. They controlled most aspects of a person's daily life in Europe, and much of the political realm as well. From birth to death, the church controlled you. And how did they do that? When you were born, you were baptized in the church, you were christened. When you married, you got married in the church. You tithed your whole adult life to the church, and when you died, you were given your rights. So it was a very controlling form of life in Europe during this time. Europe, however, was not unified and cohesive the way we look at it today. There were actually splintered seats of power all over with their own king and queens who were in competition to be the wealthiest and the most powerful. Another thing that's going to lead to westward expansion and exploration is going to be improving technology for sea travel, the astrolabe class. This made astrological calculations possible. The caravel, invented by the Portuguese for lightning fast speed on the seas. But it's going to be the reawakening of commerce after the time of the bubonic plague or the Black Death that is really going to be the biggest push for the age of exploration. Now, what was the Black Death? This class was the most devastating pandemic in human history. In the 1300s, it killed upwards of 200 million people. So do you think the bubonic plague still exists? I'm sorry to say that it does. There were actually 15 cases in the United States alone in 2015. You can find cases all over the world, so it's never completely been stamped out. But all of these things came together to create a difficult time in human history and to lead to an inevitable rebound, and trade is going to begin to increase. Exploration for new markets are the big demand. We want resources. We need resources like spices. Pepper was very popular, believe it or not. Pepper was even used as a form of currency at some point in time. So we need these new items, these new resources. We need places to sell our market goods, and we need places to purchase. And up until this point, mainly travel occurred on the Silk Road. Mainly it was on land, a little bit of sea travel, just, port to port close by, but not long, lengthy distances, right? Now, the Portuguese are going to be the first to lead out with the age of exploration. Henry the Navigator starts it all and leads the age of discovery. Listen, interesting as a side note, Christopher Columbus married a woman who grew up in Henry the Navigator's household. Bartolomeu Diaz sailed around the tip of Africa for the first time. Vasco da Gama was the first to reach India by ocean route. And as the Portuguese flourished in their travels, they occupied several islands off the coast of Africa. It's called the Gold Coast of Africa. And they developed the first sugar plantations there. And listen, class, this is really going to set the stage for things to come, like the African slave trade. But Portugal might have started this travel. Spain is very soon going to bypass them in power and travels and everything. They're going to become the superpower of the world very, very quickly. Now, Christopher Columbus was an Italian, but he worked in Portugal, and he was inspired to reach Asia by going west instead of east. He claimed to have had a religious mission to fulfill as well as an economic mission. This is what he said: "God made me the messenger of the new heavens and of the new earth, and he will show me the spot to find it." He thought he could reach Asia markets going west, because at the time the world believed it was much smaller than it is. He did not realize anything existed between Europe and Asia. So the Portuguese were not impressed. They'd already been traveling around, and they weren't impressed with his plans, so he turned to Spain. And a lot of things had come together in the 1490s to make this happen. First of all, the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella joined two powerful families, leading to the European reigning monarch for a while. They needed a name for themselves. They needed power. They needed money. And also happening during this time was the Reconquista. Now, this is something that really had been going on for hundreds of years, where Spain was trying to take land back that had been lost to the Muslims. You might have heard of the Crusades. But Muslims had taken over a lot of their area, and they were able and successful to take it back from the Muslims in the 1490s. Plus, another thing took place pushing this exploration, and that was, unfortunately, the Jewish Inquisition. The Jewish pogroms in Spain are going to give money needed to finance these travels of Christopher Columbus. And what is the Spanish Inquisition or the pogroms? It wasn't good to be Jewish during this time. They were forced to convert to Christianity, or they would possibly die, or they would have to leave. And even if they did convert to Christianity, they ended up losing all of their livelihood, their money. And Spain took this money, confiscated money, and financed the travels of Christopher Columbus. So his first voyage was in 1492, 90 men, 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. And he further inspired other explorers to come after him. Cabral, Magellan was the first to go around the world. Amerigo Vespucci, that's who America is actually named after. But he said, again, he has economic motives for exploration, plus religious. And his first encounters were with natives called the Taínos in the Caribbean islands. It was on Hispaniola, or modern-day Haiti, Dominican Republic. We don't know a lot about the Indian perception of Europeans, but what we do know is obviously they were impressed by European technology. They thought that they were possibly gods, but also we know that from accounts that they were repulsed by the Europeans' beards, breath, and bad manners. Now, Columbus called them Indians. He said they were very peaceful. But he called them Indians because he thought he was in India. So like the Spanish conquistadors who were going to come later, and many other European explorers, Columbus encounters indigenous people, and it's going to lead to devastating results for them. And much of this controversy, class, to decide should we celebrate this man, is going to come with interactions with the people and his use of violence, slavery, and forced conversion. Also, the introduction of disease. Now, we've uncovered evidence of the damage wreaked by Columbus and his teams, and it's really led to, an outcry over how we should study him and how we should, have public celebrations of the man. Throughout his years in the New World, Columbus enacted policies that were horrific. Forced labor of natives. They were put to work for the sake of profits. Columbus sent thousands of peaceful Taino Indians from the island of Hispaniola to Spain to be sold. Many died en route. Those left behind were forced to search for gold, and there was not a lot of gold in the Caribbean islands, but that's what they wanted. And then they later forced them to work on plantations that they built. Within 60 years after Columbus landed, only a few hundred of what may have been over 250 Taino Indians were left on the island. As governor of the Indies Islands, Columbus imposed an iron discipline on this area, modern Dominican Republic. And for example, in response to native unrest and revolt, they did fight back. Columbus ordered a brutal crackdown. Many natives were killed. In an attempt to deter further rebellion, he ordered their dismembered bodies to be paraded through the streets. And to incentivize his troops class, he encouraged them to rape native women, some very, very young girls as well. Now, in addition to this controversy over enslavement, rape, violent rule, Columbus really led to some unintended consequences that's going to devastate native populations. Now, eventually his methods and actions are going to catch up with him. There were people who spoke out about the way that these natives were being treated. And at some point in time, Columbus will end up being, and his brothers are going to be detained by the king and queen and ultimately sent back to Spain. I think he even served a little time in prison. I think he ended up believing to his dying day that he had made it to India. But class, what's the reality of his travels? It was really a cataclysmic event of monumental proportions, leading to something what scholars refer to as the Columbian Exchange. And in a broader sense, what is this? And, the effects are widespread. It cannot all be dismissed as negative, but it does end up being some sort of biological warfare. So let's take a look at the Columbian Exchange. It was named for Christopher Columbus, and it was the widespread transfer of plants and animals, culture, human population, technology, and idea back and forth between the Americas, Africa, the western coast, and Europe. So that we're starting to see the beginnings of a triangular trade, okay? And that we'll talk about a little bit later. And unfortunately, there was invasive species brought in, invasive species sent back. One of those was communicable diseases. That's a byproduct of this exchange. Some scholars believe not only did Columbus and Spanish conquistadors bring disease to the New World, they took back syphilis, or sexually transmitted disease. The changes in agriculture significantly altered and changed global population. The most significant impact is between the two continents was the exchange of people, free and enslaved, but then the population is going to grow and be supported by certain crops, livestock, and agricultural goods. Unfortunately, because disease initially caused a precipitous decline in the numbers of people in the Americas, it will take them a long time to rebound. And they're going to rebound in a very unique way. We'll talk about that a little later. But traders who return to Europe with corn and potatoes and tomatoes, they're going to become very important crops in Europe by the 18th century. Also, Spanish loved their cacao beans to make chocolate. And listen, they tried to keep it a secret and did so for about 100 years. So the Columbian Exchange, in other words, can be considered both good and bad depending on who you asked. Now, Portugal and Spain signed a treaty with each other. They're both, moving around in the New World, and they signed this treaty of the Tordesillas in 1492, splitting the New World between the two. This conquest of Cortez over the Aztecs was marked by much violence and brutality, and it's later going to set up the Great Dying Class, where scores of Native American people are going to lose their life to smallpox. Also coming onto the New World was Conquistador Francisco Pizarro. He ends up in the Andes mountain range, conquers the great and mighty Incan civilization. Hernando de Soto, one of the first to come into North America. I think he was the first European in North America. He marches for several thousand miles for 4 long years, plundering, kidnapping, raping, and destroying native tribes. According to one quote at the time, Spaniards continued looking for what they knew not. He dealt with natives with unrestrained brutality. Now, in this Columbian exchange, he does leave behind some things. He leaves behind pigs and chickens. But De Soto will die in the New World in 1592 and never makes it home. But listen, the story of conquistadors is always the same class. Brutality, greed, subjugation. Some unintended consequences, some not. But it's always going to prove to be disastrous for the natives. Now, these groups of indigenous, they did fight back. It was usually not enough, but to justify, how can you justify the treatment? How can conquistadors justify how they're treating these Native Americans? Well, to do so, they're going to rely on their cultural superiority and their viewpoints, missionary zeal, and just violence. The Spanish missionaries that came with the conquistadors were from the Catholic Church, were a part of the Franciscan and the Dominican orders. And this was partial justification for their conquest. We're coming to Christianize the natives. Unfortunately, it was a convert or die type of conversion. They believe these souls can be saved, and then we can also force labor in our gold and silver mines. And there were gold and silver mines in South America, not in the Caribbean so much. There were people who spoke out against the treatment of the natives, thank goodness. One advocate for natives was Bartolomé de Las Casas. He was a Dominican friar. And Las Casas wrote about the injustices of Spanish rule toward the natives. He insisted that the Indians were rational beings and Spain had no grounds to deprive them of their land and liberty. He believed that the entire human race is one. Now, his writings encouraged the 1542 new laws, which forbade the enslavement of Indians in theory. And the Spanish, they're continuing, though, to destroy culture. They're continuing to establish domination through the region. Las Casas was also he also put forth this image that Spain was a uniquely brutal and exploitive colonizer in the Black Legend. And then finally, in 1570, the Ordinances of Discovery was passed by the Spanish crown and tried to put things in place on how are we going to treat the newly encountered Indians. All in all, really, it was too little too late. Now, this quote, class, really sums it all by Cortez. I and my companions suffer from a disease of the heart which can be cured only with gold. And that's what it was all about. Here's a painting of Pizarro and some paintings of De Soto in North America, who was, like I said, particularly brutal. So we'll wrap things up here with the idea of Europeans coming to the New World. First, it was Portuguese and the Spanish, and they're going to come into the Caribbean islands and then take over South America, and they're going to work their way upwards into North America for forts and establishments. So what's the first establishment in North America? It's going to be in 1565 in St. Augustine. But as you can see, Spain is kind of backing off their colonization of North America for a while. It's going to be 1598 before things start happening. So from 1492 to 100 years there, not a whole lot's going to happen other than De Soto's rampage. But in 1598, Don Juan de Onate traveled to Mexico onward to claim the Pueblo Indian lands for Spain. He actually married the granddaughter of Cortez and an Aztec leader, Montezuma's daughter. So this area where he was set up a settlement is going to be New Mexico today. And he settled a colony using something called the encomienda system. Now, the Spanish crown had granted colonists in the New World a certain number of natives that they should be responsible for. So this sounds good on paper, right? In theory, they should protect, convert, and instruct the natives. In reality, class, it was forced religions, it was forced hard labor, subjugation, extreme punishment for perceived misdeeds, and even death that forced tributes. Listen, it was as corrupt a system as there ever was. And eventually, it's going to lead to revolts. Now, in the very beginning, they tried to fight back. The Acoma revolt took place shortly after this system, the encomienda system, was put into place. But the Great Pueblo Uprising was the biggest of them all, and it's going to take place in 1680. The Pueblo Indians and the Plains Indians and the Indians in this region had had enough. And one of the most dramatic and successful uprisings by American Indians against the Spanish took place at the Great Pueblo Uprising. They killed 400 Spanish. They drove the remaining 2,500 out of the region. It was led by a spiritual medicine man called the Pope. Class, it's going to be 12 years before Spain makes it back to the region. So good for them. Still, all in all, Pandora's box has been opened. Europeans are going to begin to make their way to the New World. Next up, class, is the Dutch and the French. Now, the French are actually going to get along pretty well with the natives. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to take a look at the English colonization attempts and their colonies that they'll establish in North America and how things are going to look very different from the rest of the Europeans. As usual, class, keep in touch.